Nothing in Thomas Brennan's 47 years of desert living could have prepared him for what was about to unfold that scorching July afternoon in the Badlands of Arizona Territory. The blood droplets caught his eye first, crimson pearls scattered across the baked earth like some twisted trail of breadcrumbs left by Death himself. Each drop told a story Thomas wasn't sure he wanted to read, but curiosity, that fatal human flaw that had gotten more good men killed than all the Apache raids combined, pulled him forward step by reluctant step down a path that would change everything. What Thomas didn't know was that following this blood trail would drag him straight into the deadliest conspiracy the Arizona Territory had ever seen, a web of corruption that reached all the way to Washington itself. What he couldn't have imagined was that the wounded stranger he was about to discover would hold the key to either lasting peace or a war that would consume every living soul between the Colorado River and the Mexican border. And what would haunt him for the rest of his days was this simple truth: sometimes a single act of mercy can alter the course of history in ways that echo through generations, rippling outward like stones thrown into still water, touching lives not yet born. The drops led him around the weathered corner of his barn, past the chicken coop where his hens pecked nervously at the dust, their feathers ruffled by an unease they couldn't name, past the broken wagon wheel he'd been meaning to fix for 3 months now, past the rusty plow that had seen better decades. With each step the stains grew larger, fresher, more urgent, painting a picture of someone fighting for their life with every labored heartbeat. Thomas gripped his Winchester tighter, the familiar weight of the rifle offering little comfort. 47 years in this god-forsaken territory had taught him that blood this fresh usually meant trouble was still breathing nearby, probably watching him through a rifle scope at this very moment, finger poised over a trigger that could end his story before the next chapter even began. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for what waited by his water well. Slumped against the stone wall like a broken marionette sat a young Native American warrior, his bronze skin slick with sweat despite the precious shade of the cottonwood tree overhead. His breathing came in sharp, desperate gasps that spoke of punctured lungs and internal bleeding, and his dark eyes tracked Thomas's approach with the wariness of a hunted animal who knew the wolves were circling closer with every passing second. The warrior's black hair hung in blood-matted strands across his face, and his buckskin clothing was torn and stained with dirt and gore. One hand pressed desperately against his left side, where something had torn through flesh and muscle, while the other reached weakly toward the wooden bucket that hung just 3 feet above his head, so close to salvation, yet impossibly far for a man whose strength was bleeding out onto the dusty ground. But it was the wound itself that made Thomas's blood run cold as Winter Creek water. A bullet hole, clean through the left side, perfectly placed to cause maximum damage without hitting vital organs immediately. The kind of shot that would let a man live long enough to suffer, long enough to think about his mistakes, long enough to watch his life drain away, drop by crimson drop. Fresh powder burns marked the entry point like a brand, telling Thomas everything he needed to know, and more than he wanted to. This man had been shot at close range recently by someone who knew exactly where to place a bullet for maximum agony. The question that set Thomas's nerves on fire like kerosene-soaked kindling was simple yet terrifying. Where was the shooter now? Were they watching from the ridge? Were they already riding hard toward his ranch with more men and bigger guns? Were they close enough to put a bullet through his skull before he could even think about running? The wounded man tried to speak, his lips cracked and bleeding from the merciless sun that had been baking the Arizona Territory for 3 solid weeks without a drop of rain. Only one word escaped, barely a whisper carried on the desert wind. Water. Thomas knew the smart play. Hell, every settler within 100 miles would tell him the same thing without hesitation. Put a bullet in the savage's brain and bury the evidence deep where the coyotes would scatter the bones and no questions would ever be asked. This was 1849, and showing mercy to a wounded Indian was like signing your own death warrant in blood, sealing your fate with the kind of signature that couldn't be erased or explained away when the war parties came looking for revenge. But something in those dark eyes stopped him cold, froze him in place like he'd been struck by lightning. Not just pain, not just desperation, not just the universal human fear of death recognition, intelligence, understanding. This man comprehended every word Thomas might speak, could read the hesitation and conflict written across a white man's face, could see the internal war being fought between mercy and survival. Thomas made his choice in that heartbeat, a decision that would echo through the remainder of his days like thunder rolling across the desert floor. He set down his rifle against the well stones, and reached for the wooden bucket with hands that trembled despite his best efforts to appear calm. What he didn't know was that this simple act of human decency was about to unleash forces that would shake the very foundations of the Arizona Territory like an earthquake, toppling corrupt officials and exposing conspiracies that reached into the highest levels of government. What he couldn't foresee was that the riders already tracking this blood trail would arrive tomorrow with questions he couldn't answer, intentions he couldn't imagine, and orders that came from men who valued profit over peace, gold over human life, power over justice. And what would terrify him most in the long sleepless nights to come was discovering that the wounded stranger bleeding by his well wasn't just any Apache warrior. He was the one man standing between lasting peace and a war that would consume everything Thomas held dear, everything he'd built in 4 decades of backbreaking work under the merciless desert sun. The water hit the man's lips like salvation itself flowing down from heaven. He drank with the desperate hunger of someone who'd been crawling through hell for days, 3 full buckets before his trembling hands could hold the rim steady enough to control the flow. Thomas watched every swallow, his mind racing with the implications of what he'd just done, the bridges he'd just burned, the enemies he'd just made simply by showing basic human compassion to a fellow creature in agony. Name. The man gasped between sips, his English heavily accented but surprisingly clear for someone who was supposed to be a savage incapable of civilized communication. My name. Thomas felt his world tilt slightly off its axis, like the earth itself had shifted beneath his boots. A native who spoke perfect English. Here, now, shot and bleeding at his well like some twisted gift from whatever gods watched over this cursed territory. Nothing about this made sense, and in Thomas's experience, things that didn't make sense usually ended with good men dead and their families wearing black to funerals. Thomas Brennan, he replied cautiously, his voice hoarse from the dust and heat. This is my ranch, has been for 23 years. Dakota nodded weakly, then did something that made Thomas's skin crawl with unease, made every nerve in his body scream warnings about danger approaching like wildfire across dry grass. The wounded man smiled. Not the grateful smile of a saved man, not the relieved expression of someone who'd just been pulled back from death's door, but the knowing smile of someone who understood exactly what was coming over that distant ridge, who could read signs in the wind that white men couldn't even see. You saved my life, Dakota whispered, each word a struggle against pain and weakness. But now, you in danger too, big danger. What kind of danger? Thomas asked, though part of him already knew he didn't want to hear the answer. Dakota's response came in fragments, each word extracted like bullets from a wound. They, hunting me, not normal hunting, not for bounty or revenge. They want me dead before tomorrow's sunrise. Why? What happens tomorrow that's so important? Peace treaty, Dakota managed, his dark eyes boring into Thomas's soul. I supposed to sign, for my people, last hope for peace. Thomas's blood turned to ice water in his veins, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped animal. The peace treaty. Every soul in the territory had been talking about it for months. The agreement that would finally end the blood-soaked war between the Apache and the settlers. The document that would bring safety to families who'd been living in fear for generations. The chance for children to grow up without hearing war cries in the night. And this man, "You're the negotiator," Thomas asked, though he already knew the answer from the weight of destiny he could see crushing down on those wounded shoulders. My father, Chief Ayana, chose me to speak for our people. But someone doesn't want peace. Someone making too much money from war. The implications crashed into Thomas like a physical blow, like being trampled by a spooked horse. If Dakota died before tomorrow, the treaty died with him. The war would continue, maybe forever, consuming another generation of children on both sides, and whoever had shot him knew exactly what they were doing, understood the precise mathematics of murder and its consequences. That's when Thomas heard it, the sound that had kept him alive through 15 years of frontier living, the rhythm that separated breathing men from corpses. Hoofbeats, multiple horses, riding hard and fast, coming straight for his ranch with the urgency of men on a mission that couldn't wait for sunrise. Dakota heard them too, his enhanced senses picking up sounds that white men would miss completely. His eyes went wide with what looked like genuine terror, and he tried to push himself upright against the well, as if making himself smaller might somehow make him invisible to whatever was approaching across the desert floor. Hide me, he pleaded, his voice carrying the desperation of a man who knew exactly what his captors would do to him before they allowed death to end his suffering. "Please." Thomas looked toward the dust cloud rising from the approaching riders, then back at the wounded man who held the future of Arizona in his bleeding hands. Every instinct screamed at him to drag this stranger away from his property, hide the evidence of their meeting, pretend none of this had ever happened, and hope that ignorance might protect him from whatever storm was about to break over his small corner of the world. But the hoofbeats were too close now, too numerous, too purposeful. 5 horses, maybe 6, all moving at a gallop that suggested they weren't coming for a friendly visit or a casual conversation about the weather. These men had business here, the kind of business that usually ended with graves being dug and witnesses disappearing into the desert forever. Thomas made a choice that would haunt him for the rest of his days, a decision that placed him squarely in the crosshairs of forces he couldn't begin to understand. He couldn't move Dakota without killing him. The blood loss was too severe for any kind of transportation, but he could shield him, could place his own body between the wounded Apache and whatever was coming over that hill with murder in their hearts. Stepping directly in front of the wounded man, blocking him from view with his own considerable frame, Thomas tried to look like a simple rancher whose biggest concern was a broken fence post and the price of cattle in Tucson. He picked up a hammer from his tool pile and began tapping aimlessly at a fence rail, hoping to appear busy and innocent when the storm arrived. The riders crested the hill like a tornado given human form, dust billowing behind them in great clouds that darkened the sky, rifles glinting in the afternoon sun like promises of violence yet to come. Thomas recognized the lead rider immediately, would have known that silhouette anywhere. Sheriff Dixon Webb, a man whose reputation for violence preceded him into every town from here to Santa Fe like the smell of death following a battlefield. Webb was the kind of lawman who shot first and asked questions later, especially when it came to Indian troubles that might interrupt the flow of federal money into local pockets. The kind who collected scalps as trophies and called it justice, who burned down ranches and everyone in them if he suspected disloyalty to the cause of westward expansion. The kind of man who would torture information from a wounded prisoner for hours before ending their misery with a bullet behind the ear. But it was the men riding beside Webb that made Thomas's mouth go desert dry, made his hands shake despite years of experience in life-or-death situations. Federal agents by their look and bearing, which meant this wasn't just a local manhunt anymore. This had escalated to something that reached all the way back to Washington, something that involved men in expensive suits making decisions about life and death from the comfort of offices thousands of miles away. Webb reined in his horse just 10 feet away, close enough that Thomas could see the cold calculation in his pale blue eyes, could smell the whiskey on his breath and the gun oil on his clothes. The other riders spread out in a semicircle, hands resting casually on their weapons in the universal language of men prepared for violence. This wasn't a social call, and everyone present understood that fact without a word being spoken. "Afternoon, Brennan," Webb said, his voice carrying the lazy drawl of a man who knew he held all the cards and enjoyed watching lesser men squirm under pressure. "We're tracking a wounded Apache. Blood trail leads right to your property like a map drawn in red ink." Thomas felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the evening air beginning to cool the desert floor. "Haven't seen any Indians, Sheriff. Been working the south fence all day, fixing the damage from last week's storm." Webb's eyes swept across the ranch, taking in every detail with the methodical thoroughness of a predator cataloging its hunting ground. The man missed nothing. It's what made him so dangerous and so effective at his particular brand of frontier justice. His gaze lingered on the dark stains in the dirt near the well, and Thomas felt his stomach drop like a stone into an endless pit. "That's so." Webb dismounted slowly, deliberately, making a show of his casual confidence. "Because that sure looks like blood to me. Fresh blood. And unless you've been butchering cattle next to your drinking water, I'd say someone's been here recently. Someone bleeding." Behind Thomas, hidden by the stone wall of the well and his own considerable frame, Dakota remained perfectly still, but Thomas could feel the tension radiating from him like heat from a forge, could sense the wounded warrior gathering what remained of his strength for whatever might come next. One sound, one movement, one telltale sign of breathing, and they were both dead men walking. Webb took 3 steps closer, his hand now resting openly on his pistol grip in a gesture that was both casual and threatening. "You know what the penalty is for harboring Indian fugitives, don't you, Brennan? It's the same penalty as for treason against the United States government. A rope around the neck until dead, body left hanging as an example to others who might consider such foolishness. The words hung in the air like a death sentence already passed, waiting only for the rope to be tied and the trapdoor to open. Thomas felt every muscle in his body coiled tight as a spring, ready to fight or run, knowing that neither option would save them from what was coming. Webb was too close now, too observant, too experienced in reading men's faces for lies and deception. Any sudden movement would expose Dakota, and once that happened, bullets would start flying and good men would die in the dust. That's when something impossible happened. Something that changed the entire dynamic of the confrontation in ways that nobody could have predicted. One of the federal agents, a tall man with steel gray hair and intelligent eyes that missed nothing, stepped forward and spoke words that shifted the balance of power like an earthquake reshaping the landscape. "Sheriff Webb, I think there's been a significant misunderstanding here." Webb spun around, confusion flickering across his weathered features like shadows cast by firelight. "What kind of misunderstanding, Agent Morrison?" "We're tracking a murderer." Morrison pulled out an official-looking document, its government seal glinting in the sunlight like a badge of ultimate authority. "Direct orders from Washington, delivered by special courier this morning. All pursuit of the Apache peace negotiator is to cease immediately and unconditionally." Thomas felt the world shift beneath his feet like sand in an earthquake. The Apache negotiator. They knew who Dakota was, understood the importance of the man bleeding behind his well, which meant, "I don't understand," Webb sputtered, his confidence cracking like ice in spring sunshine. "My orders were clear. The peace treaty negotiations are under federal protection now," Morrison explained with the calm authority of a man who spoke for the government itself. "Any interference with the Apache delegation is considered an act of treason against the United States. The president himself has taken a personal interest in these proceedings." But Webb wasn't backing down, wasn't accepting the new reality being forced upon him. His hand tightened on his pistol grip until his knuckles went white as bone. "That Indian murdered Colonel Peterson 2 nights ago during the preliminary negotiations. I have signed warrants and direct orders from the territorial governor." Morrison's voice went cold as winter steel, carrying undertones that promised consequences for those who chose to ignore federal authority. "Your orders have been superseded by direct presidential decree, Sheriff. Stand down immediately." What happened next moved faster than thought, faster than any man present could react to or control. Webb's face cycled through confusion, rage, and desperate calculation before settling on the expression of a cornered animal with nothing left to lose. In one smooth motion, he drew his pistol and pointed it directly at Morrison's chest, crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. "I don't think so, Agent Morrison," Webb snarled, his mask of civilized law enforcement finally slipping to reveal the savage underneath. "You see, some of us have different orders. Orders that pay a lot better than government wages. Orders that come from men who understand the real value of keeping this territory unstable." Thomas watched in growing horror as the truth unfolded before his eyes like a flower blooming in fast motion. Webb wasn't just following orders, he was part of something larger, something darker, part of whatever force wanted Dakota dead and the peace treaty destroyed in flames. The corruption reached deeper than anyone had imagined, tentacles of greed and violence spreading through the territorial government like poison through a water supply. That's when Dakota made his move, demonstrating the kind of courage that songs are written about and legends built upon. Despite his wound, despite his weakness, despite the blood he'd lost and the pain that must have been overwhelming, the Apache warrior rose from behind the well with fluid grace that spoke of years of training and natural athleticism. But he wasn't attacking, wasn't reaching for weapons or making threatening gestures. Instead, he spoke one word in his native tongue, a word that made Webb's face go white as sun-bleached bone. "Ayanna," Dakota said simply, the name carrying weight and meaning that transcended language barriers. Webb's pistol wavered in his grip, his confidence cracking like a dam under pressure. "You, Chief Ayanna's son," Dakota confirmed in perfect English, his voice carrying the authority of bloodline and birthright. "The man you were hired to kill before tomorrow's peace ceremony." Thomas felt the pieces clicking into place like the tumblers of a lock finally opening to reveal its secrets. Dakota wasn't just any negotiator sent to sign papers and make speeches. He was Apache royalty, the son of the most powerful chief in the territory, a man whose death would guarantee war for another generation, and someone had paid good money to ensure that death happened before peace could take root. But Morrison was smiling now, and Thomas realized the federal agent had been playing a deeper game all along, operating with information and authority that went far beyond what any of them had suspected. "Thank you, Sheriff Webb," Morrison said with the calm satisfaction of a hunter whose trap had finally been sprung. "That confession will look very nice in my report to Washington. Very nice indeed." Webb's face went purple with rage, veins standing out on his forehead like rope. "You set me up, you bastard." "I investigated you," Morrison corrected with the precision of a man who chose his words carefully. "There's a difference. Did you really think Washington wouldn't notice when peace negotiators started turning up dead under mysterious circumstances? Did you honestly believe we wouldn't follow the money trail back to the arms dealers who've been profiting from this war for the past decade?" Thomas watched transfixed as Webb's world collapsed around him like a house built on sand. The corrupt sheriff raised his pistol toward Morrison, desperation overriding whatever remained of his common sense and survival instincts. But before he could fire, something extraordinary happened that would be talked about in saloons and trading posts for years to come. From the distant hills came a sound that made every man freeze in place, the thunder of many horses moving fast across hard ground. Not 6 riders this time, not even a dozen. An entire Apache war party was riding toward Thomas's ranch, and they would arrive within minutes with the fury of ancestors and the righteousness of the wronged. Webb's face went ashen, all the color draining from his features like water from a broken bucket. "How many are coming?" Dakota smiled despite his pain, despite the blood still seeping through his fingers, enough to see justice done. The sound grew louder, multiplying until it filled the air like an earthquake rolling across the plains. Thomas counted the dust clouds on the horizon. 20 riders, maybe 30, all moving in perfect formation toward his little ranch, with the precision of a military unit and the determination of men seeking justice for wrongs that could never be forgiven or forgotten. Webb made one last desperate play, swinging his pistol toward Thomas with the wild eyes of a man who knew his time was running out. "This is your fault, Farmer. You helped him signal them, didn't you? You're part of this conspiracy." "I gave a dying man water," Thomas replied, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice in the face of imminent death. "Same as I'd do for any suffering creature on my land, regardless of the color of their skin or the language they speak." The Apache riders came over the horizon like a vision from another world, like something out of the old stories that men told around campfires to frighten children into obedience. 30 warriors on horseback, moving in perfect formation, their war paint gleaming in the dying sunlight, their weapons glinting with promises of violence and vengeance. But as they drew closer, Thomas realized something that defied everything he thought he knew about Indian war parties and their methods of operation. They weren't coming for battle. They were coming for justice. At the head of the group rode an elderly chief whose presence commanded respect from 100 yards away, whose very bearing spoke of wisdom earned through decades of leadership and struggle. His gray hair was braided with eagle feathers that caught the light like captured sunbeams, and despite his age, he sat his horse with the dignity and strength of a man who had never bowed to anyone, never compromised his principles for convenience or safety. Behind him rode warriors of every age, from seasoned fighters whose scars told stories of battles won and lost, to young braves barely old enough to carry weapons but eager to prove themselves worthy of their heritage. Their horses moved as one, a symphony of muscle and motion that spoke of years of training and natural harmony between rider and mount. But their weapons remained sheathed, their intentions focused not on slaughter, but on something far more meaningful. Webb's face cycled through confusion, fear, and desperate calculation as he tried to process this new development. He still held his pistol trained on Thomas, but his hand shook like a man with fever, and sweat ran down his face in streams despite the cooling evening air. "This changes nothing," Webb said, though his voice cracked with the strain of maintaining his bluff. "I still have my orders, still have my duty to the territorial government." "Your orders," came a new voice from behind him, "are no longer valid, and they never were legitimate." Everyone turned to see Agent Morrison holding up another official document, this one bearing seals and signatures that carried the weight of ultimate authority. "This came through this morning by special courier, Sheriff, direct from the territorial governor himself, countersigned by the Secretary of War. All pursuit of Apache peace negotiators is suspended pending a full investigation into the murder of Colonel Peterson and related criminal activities." Webb's face went purple with rage, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him like walls made of sand. You're lying, Morrison. You've been lying from the beginning. Check your own dispatch pouch. Morrison interrupted with the calm authority of a man who held all the cards. Unless you've been too busy collecting blood money to read your official correspondence. The truth has a way of catching up with men like you, Webb. It always does. The Apache riders formed a wide circle around the ranch, not threatening but unmistakably present. Their very existence a reminder that justice could take many forms and wasn't always dispensed in courtrooms by men in black robes. Their chief dismounted with the fluid grace of a man half his age and walked slowly toward the well where his son waited, his ancient eyes never leaving Dakota's face, searching for signs of serious injury while cataloging every detail of the confrontation. When father and son embraced, a collective sigh seemed to rise from the assembled warriors, a sound that spoke of relief and family bonds that transcended political boundaries and racial divisions. Thomas found himself witnessing something sacred, the reunion of a leader with his people, a father with his child, a peace negotiator with those he'd sworn to protect even at the cost of his own life. The chief spoke to his son in rapid Apache, his weathered hands checking the wound with the gentle expertise of a man who had tended many battlefield injuries over the years. His face remained grave with concern, but there was also pride there, pride in a son who had faced death rather than abandon his mission of peace. Dakota responded in the same language, but Thomas caught enough English mixed in to understand the general meaning, the truth about the conspiracy, the names of those involved, the evidence that would bring justice to those who had profited from war and suffering. When the conversation ended, the chief turned to face Webb with eyes like black diamonds, hard and unforgiving and capable of cutting through any lie or deception. When he spoke, his English was perfect and precise, carrying the authority of a man who had negotiated with presidents and generals. "Sheriff Webb, my son tells me you came here to murder him in cold blood." Webb's pistol wavered in his grip, his last vestiges of control slipping away like sand through fingers. "I came here to arrest a fugitive, to uphold the law as I swore to do." "A fugitive from your own corruption," the chief replied, his voice carrying the weight of absolute moral authority. "A man whose only crime was discovering how you and your associates have been profiting from war between our peoples, how you've been selling weapons to both sides while innocent families die in the crossfire." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, impossible to ignore or explain away. Webb's remaining allies were slowly backing their horses away from the circle, clearly calculating their chances of escape and finding them slim to non-existent. "You have no proof of these wild accusations," Webb said, but his voice cracked on the words like ice breaking under spring sunshine. The chief smiled, not warmly but with the satisfaction of a man who held all the evidence needed to see justice done. "We have Agent Morrison's testimony and documentation. We have the confessions of the real killers who told us everything before they died trying to escape our pursuit. And we have something else, something that will interest you greatly." He gestured to one of his warriors, who rode forward, carrying a leather satchel that looked official and important. From it, the warrior produced a stack of papers that made Webb's face go ashen, that drained every last drop of color from his weathered features. "Your correspondence with the gunrunners," the chief continued with relentless precision. "Every payment documented, every shipment recorded, every lie cataloged for posterity. Colonel Peterson was far more thorough in his investigation than you realize, Sheriff. He kept copies of everything." Webb's world collapsed in that moment, all his schemes and violence and betrayals revealed as futile gestures against the inevitable tide of justice. Thomas watched a corrupt man realize that all his careful planning had been for nothing, that the evidence against him was overwhelming, that the witnesses were reliable, that his fate was sealed as surely as if it had been carved in stone. But cornered animals were always the most dangerous, and men with nothing left to lose were capable of acts that defied reason and morality. Webb swung his pistol toward the chief, desperation overriding whatever remained of his survival instincts. "If I'm going down, old man, I'm taking you with me. Let's see how your peace treaty works without any negotiators left alive." What happened next moved faster than thought, faster than any of the trained fighters present could react to or control. Dakota threw himself between the gun and his father despite his wound, despite his weakness, despite the certainty that such an action would likely cost him his life. The pistol fired with a sound like thunder, and 30 Apache warriors reached for their weapons in perfect unison, ready to turn the ranch into a battlefield that would be remembered for generations. But the shot went wild, the bullet burying itself harmlessly in a fence post. Because Thomas Brennan, a simple rancher who just wanted to help a suffering fellow human being, had tackled Sheriff Webb from behind, sending them both crashing to the ground in a tangle of dust and desperate violence. The dust settled slowly, like a curtain falling on the final act of a bloody play. Webb lay motionless beneath Thomas, his pistol thrown clear by the impact, his dreams of wealth and power scattered like tumbleweeds in the desert wind. Morrison and his men quickly secured both Webb and his remaining co-conspirators, while the Apache warriors slowly lowered their weapons and allowed justice to take its proper course. But it was what happened next that would stay with Thomas for the rest of his life, that would give meaning to all the choices he'd made and all the risks he'd taken. The chief walked slowly to where Thomas sat, catching his breath in the dirt, his clothes torn and dusty from the struggle. The old man's weathered face showed no readable expression as he studied this white rancher who had risked everything for a stranger, who had chosen compassion over safety, courage over comfort. Then, without warning or explanation, he placed both hands on Thomas's shoulders and spoke in Apache words that carried the weight of ceremony, of honor, of recognition that transcended cultural boundaries and racial divisions. Dakota translated, his voice thick with emotion and respect. He says, "You are now brother to our people, bound by bonds stronger than blood or birth. What you did today, showing mercy to an enemy, risking your life for truth, choosing courage over fear, these are the actions of a true warrior, regardless of the color of his skin or the language of his prayers." Thomas felt something fundamental shift in his chest, like a door opening to let in light he'd never seen before, like a wall crumbling to reveal vistas he'd never imagined. All his life he'd been taught that Indians were savages, enemies of civilization, obstacles to progress that needed to be removed or destroyed. But looking into the chief's ancient eyes, he saw only wisdom, dignity, and a kind of respect he'd never earned from his own people, never even dreamed of receiving. The ceremony that followed was unlike anything Thomas had ever witnessed or imagined possible. The Apache warriors dismounted and formed a perfect circle around him, their movements coordinated and meaningful in ways that spoke of traditions older than written history. One by one they approached and touched his hand, not a handshake in the white man's fashion, but something deeper, more profound, a recognition of kinship that transcended skin color, language, or cultural differences. When the last warrior had paid his respects, the chief presented Thomas with a gift that took his breath away and left him speechless with wonder. A war lance decorated with eagle feathers and intricate beadwork, its shaft worn smooth by generations of hands, its point gleaming with the promise of honor and responsibility. "This belonged to my grandfather," the chief explained with solemn ceremony, "and his grandfather before him, stretching back through the generations to the dawn of our people. It has never been carried by anyone not born Apache, never been entrusted to one outside our blood, until today." As the sun set over the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to bless the proceedings with divine approval, the Apache prepared to depart. Dakota's wound had been properly treated by the tribal medicine man using techniques passed down through centuries of healing tradition, and though he was still weak from blood loss, he would live to see the peace treaty signed and the real conspirators brought to justice. Before mounting his horse, Dakota clasped Thomas's hand one final time, his grip strong despite his recent ordeal. "You saved more than my life today, brother. You saved the peace between our peoples, prevented a war that would have consumed countless innocent lives on both sides." "I just gave a thirsty man some water," Thomas replied, still struggling to comprehend the magnitude of what had transpired. Dakota smiled with genuine warmth and affection. "Sometimes that's exactly how the world changes, brother. One cup of water at a time, one act of kindness at a time, one moment of courage at a time." 24 hours later, exactly as the title had promised, they were gone, vanishing into the desert like spirits returning to the realm of legend. But they left behind something far more precious than gold or silver, proof that in a world full of hatred and fear, simple human decency could still work miracles, could still bridge the widest gaps between different peoples and different ways of life. Webb and his co-conspirators were tried and convicted of treason, corruption, and conspiracy to commit murder. The gun-running operation that had fueled years of conflict was dismantled completely, its leaders imprisoned or executed according to military justice. The peace treaty was not only signed but expanded to include all the tribes of the territory, creating a framework for cooperation that would last for generations. And Thomas Brennan, a simple rancher who had shown mercy to a stranger, became the first white man in territorial history to be formally adopted into the Apache Nation, a bridge between two worlds that had seemed forever divided by misunderstanding and mistrust. Because sometimes, in the brutal landscape of the Old West, the greatest battles weren't won with guns or violence, but with something far more powerful and enduring: the courage to see enemies as human beings, the wisdom to choose compassion over fear, and the faith that individual acts of kindness could change the course of history itself. Now click on the video on the screen to hear a story even better than this one, with a twist so powerful you won't forget it anytime soon. Click on the video.